Thank you very much for inviting me. I know that the original plan would have been to hold this meeting in person, and I would have been very grateful to have this business reason to come back to Rome and see all of you. But I will be back when the law permits. So to give you a little bit of background, give this audience a little bit of background, the internet as we know it, of course, it's a global commercial entity now. It's very important, but it started out as a very small scientific, I don't know, administrative network for scientists and government contractors. And getting from those early days to now has been the ride of a lifetime. And I think we can all think of things we wish had been thought of earlier on before we got sort of stuck in this particular future with these particular limitations. But the internet exchange could not have been a better idea. There's the things that we're doing with internet exchanges all over the world were not foreseen and they were not foreseeable. But when the need arose, the right people in each region got together and created something very much like NAMX. And I have a happy part in that. I started the Palo Alto Internet Exchange, PAIX. And so I have a small role in that history. And I'm just grateful to call all of you colleagues. Some of you also maybe used to be customers. But what I'd like to do today is to contextualize the internet within the broader outlines of human history, because it has changed the economy. It has changed the way that we innovate. It has changed the way that we develop whatever future the humanity is going to have. And to do that, I'm going to need to take you on a little bit of a history trip because I have to talk about where Unix came from. Because without Unix, there would not have been Linux, would not have been BSD, probably would not have been an internet. And of course, the internet had other ingredients and it has a lot of other participants now. But the driving force of the openness of the internet, the ability to create new protocols, new applications, things like the web, all came about because of the open systems model. And Unix, for all of its flaws, was the foundation of that model. I had the honor and the pleasure of working for a company that made a lot of the equipment that was used on that early internet. It's called Digital Equipment Corporation, and you may have heard of them. They used to make something called the VAX. But things did not go well for Digital Equipment Corporation. They are dead now. And I wanted to use some of their missteps and some of their missed opportunities as a way to highlight what I call the art of the impossible. And toward the end of this, I hope it's clear why I call it that. So there we go. So this was a basic building block of a lot of the technology that Digital Equipment made. It's called a BA23, not that you need to know that. I actually own two of these in my lab downstairs so that I can run the old equipment with the old software if I choose to. It's possible the Computer History Museum would be interested in some of what I've got down there, like the original FROOT server. In any case, this was the general way that we did things in that era. We're talking about the late 70s and throughout the 80s, was that you would come up with some rack mountable piece of equipment similar to the rack mount PCs and blade servers and routers and switches that we see today. And then you would populate it with some electronics that would give it some personality, some capabilities. So If you take one of these apart and say, great, I see this beautiful white cover, what's in there? Ultimately, you're going to see a card cage like this. And that bus, those 4 slots that each have 4 different connectors, that was called the Q bus, specifically the Q22 bus, if we have any historians among us. The size of that bus would indicate how much expansion capability you would have. And so that would be, for example, how many storage controllers, how much memory, the total capabilities of your computer would be dictated by the size of that bus as much as by the speed of the electronics. And I want to point out that the first internet speaking Unix system was not this one. This is a more modern one, but it was these electronics. It was that CPU. It was called the PDP-11, later to be replaced by the VAX. So Digital Equipment was the second largest computer-related services company in the world after IBM during those years. I started my career at Digital in 1988. And so they were very successful. Had maybe 130,000 employees. They were selling everything to everybody. They were just, if you couldn't afford IBM, you bought Digital, and it was the good times. Digital didn't know about Unix at first. It turns out they were making these computers and selling them to scientists and engineers who would sometimes throw away all of Digital's software and replace it with Unix. So what was interesting about that is that it meant they were successful for reasons they did not understand, that they did not know about. When they decided to compete in the small computer arena, smaller than what's on your screen now, they made some interesting choices, and I want to explain what happened. So if you could imagine selling a device that has this backplane, except that 2 of the 4 slots have been closed off. They poured glue. They poured black epoxy glue into 2 of the 4 slots so that there would be no expansion capability. And then they sold what was essentially a crippled version of their other computers at a discount, at a much lower price. And in this way, they tried to retain the pricing of their old products while still entering a new market. This was not successful. What it did instead is it convinced everyone else in the industry that Digital was no threat, and that Digital would be continuing to try to sell big things to wealthy people, and that they would not understand how to really innovate, how to be part of the next generation of technology. So that was Digital trying to use the art of the impossible. They were trying to close off some expansion capabilities. Now, one of the things that happened immediately was that people would buy the crippled version of this, and then they would go to the catalog and buy the uncrippled backplane and use a screwdriver, and in about 30 minutes they could remove the epoxy. But that was not the danger. The danger was that Digital was removing themselves from consideration for the next generation. This here is a desktop computer that they made. Very interesting at the time. I remember when this came out. And they were very proud of it, but pretty much no one bought it. When Digital made what they called the personal operating system, they spoke all the same words that Apple speaks today about how computers should be transparent and how they should just seamlessly fold into your world. But it turned out that this was actually a PDP-11, which was a 20-year-old design that was simply shrunk. And so it was loud, it was expensive, and it was slow. So they tried to fix that. They had a faster chip. This is a picture of that faster chip. It's called the J11. And it had it would have been competitive. This is all in the early 80s. This is when IBM is still coming out with the PC, and the PC-AT doesn't exist yet. So there was still an opportunity to win this war, and this was their way to do that. But they ran into a problem. This chip, the J11, could run at, I think, 16 megahertz, which is nothing today, but it was a lot at the time. But on this particular design, they couldn't make that clock speed work. Nothing else about this system could keep up. And so they slowed the clock speed down to 10 megahertz. And from Digital's point of view, this was just a way to ship a product to customers that they thought had no better choice. And they didn't realize that if they did not compete against themselves, that they would lose, and that their choice was who would beat them and whether they themselves could beat themselves, not whether they would be beaten, right? The era where you could sell chips like this at 10 megahertz speeds was ending. Even a Sun 2 with a 68,000 chip was faster than this thing. And it had bitmap graphics and all sorts of other things. So this is what happens if you become very successful and you believe that other people have no alternatives to whatever it is you come up with. This is a picture of what you would get if you booted something called DOS 86. It was made by a company, Seattle Computer Products, and it was a version of CP/M that was meant for the very first 8086 chip. I bought this. I owned a computer that ran this. And then about a year later, Microsoft also bought this. They paid for the license for this, the software so that they could create MS-DOS. I think we can see that this company, who only made this software so that they could sell hardware, right? They had computers with 8086s. They needed to provide an operating system. They weren't trying to compete with operating systems. They were trying to compete in hardware. And Microsoft, on the other hand, never cared what hardware you had. They just wanted to compete in operating systems. And so what we're seeing here is a company that had a vision for what might be possible, was competing against a company who had a different vision about sort of how to sell what they already had. In that same time period, Microsoft released a 16-bit version of their very popular BASIC interpreter. This is what most games were written in back in those times. It should fascinate us that you could sell a BASIC interpreter for $350 US at that time. But this was Microsoft trying to make it possible for people to use computers in new ways. In other words, this was an integrated development environment, however primitive, and it's very forward-looking. It was very much the art of the possible, competing against the art of the impossible. Now, during my time at Digital Equipment, they were trying to make a faster computer, which they did. It's called the Titan. And it really was the Titan that was my reason for wanting to go to work there. But it was canceled because it would have been faster than any other mini computer DEC was selling or had on their roadmap for the next 2 or 3 years. And it did not run VAX VMS, which was the company's commercial strategy. It ran Unix. Specifically, it ran Berkeley Unix, which meant that it had TCP/IP. So once the executive team of that company figured out what was about to happen, they canceled this project. And all of the people listed here went on to have glorious careers working for companies who did not fear the future. But if what you think you're going to do is make a large profit margin on a computer like a VAX that only you can make because of patents, and that you're going to sell your operating system and all the rest of that, you should be aware that other companies that lack your powers also might lack your constraints. This was maybe the end of the road for my time there. They spent $5 billion US developing a new VAX, of which they sold about 30. This was the CPU. You can imagine the whole computer took up as much space as the primary data center at NAMX today. And the time to sell this kind of thing had ended, but the people that had been making, billions of dollars a year selling them could not be educated. And they once again assumed that they had made impossible any alternative not involving them, and that they therefore did not need to compete against anything. So meanwhile, IBM created an open platform. This had the first open bus where you could stick any kind of expansion card you wanted into it without paying any royalties or license fees. And a lot of software, a lot of hardware got developed for this thing. This is the essence of every Pentium or Opteron or otherwise modern computer that we have today, was this architecture. And it succeeded, but it did something IBM didn't appreciate, which is that it created Compaq and a lot of other competing companies, because there was nothing about this that was proprietary. Anybody could make one, and therefore anyone who could make a better one or a cheaper one would take business away from IBM. And IBM's solution to that was the PS2. All that survives of the PS2 is that keyboard. I'm using one like that to talk to you today, and the mouse connector and the keyboard connector. Everything else about it was proprietary, therefore everything else about it was not emulated by anyone. IBM eventually exited the personal computing industry, sold those assets to Lenovo. And what we should notice about this is that when IBM was trying to create a new world by offering roads to new places, open technologies that could be extended by anyone, it was vastly relevant. Not sure how commercially successful it was, but it certainly changed history. When IBM finally said, yeah, we got to make something that only we can make because we're tired of being undercut by people who don't have our cost basis, then they became irrelevant, and everybody just went on and did what they took the best alternatives then open to them. So while all of this was going on, we had a telecommunications revolution, and ultimately that led to the internet. So the device here is a modem. It stands for the modulator and the demodulator. And it was pretty much unforeseen by the phone company. The phone company here in the US at that time was a monopoly, and very loosely regulated monopoly. But their network went everywhere. There was every house, every business, everybody was connected to the telephone network. And if you wanted to buy data services from the phone company, they would be happy to sell those to you, but it would be extremely expensive, and you would only be able to talk to other customers of the same phone company. Now, Europe was smarter. Europe has always been smarter in matters of regulation, at least for the last 200 years or so. And so the idea of a digital subscriber line was a lot more common in Europe than it was here at that time. But what I want to note is if you make a device that is able to encode your digital signals into audio signals, then you can carry your digital information over a network that is meant for voice only. And there's a lot of competition about different kinds of modems, different speeds of modems, different ways to do the encoding in order to make sure that every possible bit, literally bit of capacity that was in the voice line was made available digitally. And that is what made the internet possible. Without modems, we would never have had um, WinSock. We would never have had Navigator. We would never have had any of the things that then made the internet possible. And yet the modem itself was a bypass around a deliberate impossibility. The phone company intended, just as digital had intended, to offer you one thing and one thing only, and say that if you wanted anything else, you would also have to wait for them. You would come to them, you would pay their price, you would wait for them to have what you wanted. And what turned out to happen instead is we simply bypassed all of that. We built what we had to build to get what we actually wanted. So the art of impossibility in that case by the phone company very much failed. And so even in Europe, which I think was doing a much better job for digital subscriber lines, the expectation was that it was all going to be like Minitel or some other X25 based, ATM based OSI system, something that the ITU would understand. And so I'm not convinced that Europe didn't have troubles of its own, even though they didn't need as many modems as we did. They still had nobody to talk to over the links that you could buy, because the protocols were all determined for you by government monopolies. So what you see here is inevitable disruption. And that, I think, is a couple of examples that demonstrates the cycle that concerns me today and ought to concern all of us, which is that power, the first use of power, whether it's market power or any other power, is self-preservation. So anyone who has influence is going to try to use that influence to give themselves a better future. Going to impose their conditions, their business conditions, and try to make it so that they don't have to compete. And the rest of us will often say, thank you for the innovation, happy to use what you've built, but that profit that you're making seems like somebody else could maybe do it for less. So inevitably, when you use the art of the impossible to impose conditions and to create favorable conditions for yourself, you automatically create the conditions where it is profitable to disrupt you. And that's why we have an internet, is that works. And that's how the internet was imposed, in a sense, by all of us on a bunch of powerful entities who would have preferred that we wait for them to build something and follow their rules. So in 2013, Edward Snowden, famous American contractor, disclosed quite a bit of secret material concerning the United States government and its various national security activities. Then flew to Hong Kong and then to Russia, where I think he still resides today. Now, the people who were in the business at the time did not think this was a very significant event. They, in other words, if you were in the industry, if you were in government, if you were in law enforcement, then you already knew all of this. You knew this was happening. However, this was announcing this old information to a general audience, that is to say, everyone in the world. And a lot of people didn't realize that this is how governments have always behaved. And they rose up in rebellion against the pervasive monitoring. And the IETF, which is a standards organization for the internet, adopted what they call a encrypt everything policy. They did not consider that surveillance capitalism was also a threat. They left that out. It was just national security. And that meant that those of us who had working DNS configurations, here what you see is an enterprise or a university or something that is forcing their own name server to be used, because only their own name server can reach through the firewall to get to the outside. It's now being bypassed. So that stuff over on the left is your browser speaking DNS over HTTP, and thus bypassing all of the local policy, and plus whatever security filtering might be going on or whatever monitoring might be going on, because what they saw was that something had been made impossible, and so they disrupted it. They created a new possibility. Internet exchanges have a special place in this story because it is our job in the internet exchange world to make things possible. And we're making it possible for competitors to cooperate. We're making it possible for people to work for a larger totality rather than to work for a market share grab. So you'll see almost no proprietary technology at NAMX or PAX or Equinix or anywhere else. But this itself was built as a bypass. There was a time when ISPs could only reach each other by building into a telco meet-me room. And I can remember in San Jose having to pay the price of an OC3C optical circuit for a piece of dry fiber that went over a cage wall between myself and someone else who was inside the same meet-me room. This was ripe for disruption. And now we have a community who is all about growth. It's all about doing whatever it takes to make the internet work better. And again, I'm proud to be from there. So the thought I want to leave you with is roads will generally win. If one party builds walls and another party builds roads, the roads are going to win because you can choose a different destination or a different way to get to the same place. You don't have to go through the wall. You don't have to be stopped by the wall. Walls are fixed. Roads tend to be essentially mobile. And with that, I invite discussion on either the history or the philosophy that I have expressed.
Okay, I think that we have some questions. And let me also read you some comments that really appreciate your presentation. By Vlad Biosin, this is the best webinar of today for me. Fantastic presentation from Giulio Lopresti. Great presentation at the end of the day from Fabio Cantoni. And there is also Blake Willis. Great, thanks, Paul. And we have two real questions. And one is from an anonymous attendee. And the question is, I don't know if you can read it. Do you see the art of the impossible pattern in the current networking ecosystem? I'm thinking mostly about the OTT, or are they too big to be disrupted?
OTT, over the top, is an old game and it will always be played. I am particularly concerned about closed ecosystems because they're inevitably disrupted and not always by something that is otherwise better. So for example, if your cell phone maker or your phone company has the ability to prevent you from watching a streaming service unless that streaming service pays them some fee, that may be seen by the older participants in the market as a necessary way to preserve revenue. But it leads inevitably to something like a VPN, something like the new QUIC protocol, something that is not detectable and therefore not blockable, not filterable. So I think, yes, we're going to see OTT from now until the end of time. It will just take a different form in every era. Today, we tend to see this as IP and IP or IPsec or other VPN solutions because people want to watch, I don't know, a movie, let's say, that can only be legally watched in a certain country. And therefore, you have to get a VPN that will allow you to appear to be coming from that country. So the people who want to stop this should be asking themselves, not how can I truly stop it, but why am I trying to stop this? How come I can't find a way to profit by it? Why is it that others are profiting from my work instead of me profiting from my work? In other words, those people should be trying to build better roads, not better walls.
So there is another question that is from another anonymous attendee, maybe the same person, I don't know. What will be after internet? Wow, that's really tough. What will be next breakout through?
So sadly, I'm gonna tell an old joke, which is, we don't know what the world's digital nervous system will be called 50 years from now. And we don't know what technology will be used, but we know it's going to be the internet. So I think we're going to apply the name internet to whatever we are then doing. So if it was modems and then it was, I don't know, E1 lines, and then it was ATM circuits or frame relay, if it was ISPs and then it was wireless, someday maybe we'll get mesh networks. Whatever it is that we all use to share our pictures of cats or to argue about politics or to do our commerce will be what we call the internet in that era. So what I'm looking for right now is to relax some of the earliest constraints, right? So there's an Ethernet switch inside of NAM2020 and other internet exchanges, which is carrying datagrams, and those packets are the lifeblood of the internet. Those are the blood cells of the body of the internet. And they have not gotten larger. The speed with which we transmit them has moved from 10 megabits per second to 100 gigabits per second during the last 25 years. But the maximum size of each one has not changed. And that is an unfortunate constraint that we're going to have to find a way around, and that will be somewhat painful. But if we don't solve this problem now, then when we want to do 100 terabits, then we're going to find that our cells are just too small and we can't count them anymore. So look for me to be championing MTU discovery and the ability to have a larger packet passing through the internet exchanges than can be done today.
Let me give you the most obvious question. We have another question. It's about the NSSEC from Giulio Lopresti. And the question is, what about the DNSSEC? It will be the best practice to secure your record. What do you think? This is a classic from you, I think.
Well, DNSSEC has essentially failed in the market. I was one of the people working on it in 1996, and we made some compromises because we thought it was important to get it done soon. And now it is 23 years later, and we still really don't have it. Only about 3% of the content of the DNS is secure in this way. Now, it's a very important 3%. And I certainly advise everyone, please sign your records, because there are places where you could be impersonated, your domain names could be forged, that would not work. They would be able to protect you if you would sign your own data. And you should also turn on validation so that anyone else who has signed their data will not be forgeable when those identifiers are used to reach your network. So it's still a good idea, it should still be done, but I am sad to say that it probably will never be ubiquitous. The thing we wanted to do with it was to replace X509. We wanted to get rid of the idea that you would have to make an SSL certificate and then go to Google and get Let's Encrypt to sign it for you, or go to some other company and have them sign your certificate, because their signature would then make you credible. It would make that certificate credible. I don't like the X509 signing ecosystem. I was hoping to replace that with DNSSEC. However, the web has not adopted the DNSSEC. They're not using DNSSEC to find out if an SSL certificate is secure and authentic or not. And that is, I think, an economic decision. I think that the web is driven by interests who favor the X509 approach, and these small number of companies who can charge money for those certificates. So in that sense, the web itself has been captured, and it is no longer the disruptor it once was. It now is itself ripe for disruption.
Great. There is another couple of questions, maybe the last one. I don't know if you are able to read it directly.
Yes, I can see it.
Okay. So maybe you can choose what you want, if and that what you want to answer.
So, this is Swapnil, who's one of my friends in India. And he's asking whether DNS over HTTP, which is a technology that I mentioned in my presentation, might be a pathway by which the namespace itself becomes fragmented. In other words, some new top-level domain, like .good or .bad, might only work if you are using a certain DNS service. I think no. I think that there won't be enough prospective profit from doing that, and that we will have a unified namespace, because no one wants to use a name for their products or their services which can only be seen by a small part of the global internet. So while it is a problem, DOH is a problem, we're going to have to learn how to block it at our edge networks, just to make sure that filtering isn't bypassed. It is not, it is a different problem. It is not a problem with namespace fragmentation. So I can read the next question myself, which is, where can I connect to you? So I am on LinkedIn, I am on Facebook, I am on Twitter. My email address is paul@redbarn.org, which is in my Whois record. So I am very reachable, and I encourage any of you, please do reach out to me on any of these topics or any related topic. I'm very interested in hearing what you think, and I will try to answer questions when I can.
There is a comment from common friends, that is John Suter. It's a comment. Fantastic presentation by Paul. I never tired of listening to this man. So that's it. I think that we come to the end. And so again, thank you so much, Paul. It was a pleasure and an honor, as usual. And I really hope to meet you in person very soon. That you can, drive to Rome very soon, or I can visit you somewhere, or meet you somewhere. Okay.
You're always welcome here. I do hope to return to Italy when it is safe to do so, and I pray for the safety of all of us. Thank you for inviting me to present today.
Thank you so much.